Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Father, we thank you for a new week. Lots to do, short week, a week that ends with the remembrance of the resurrection of your Son. And we pray that as we study your word, that it would change us, that we would be reminded of your love for us as demonstrated in that wonderful sacrifice and deliverance from death. We ask for your help this morning in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we're in Deuteronomy chapter 20, and this is perhaps one of the more controversial passages in the book, if only because it's about war. And we've seen the theme of war come up a few times in this book, but here God explicitly commands Israel to do things that the modern mind simply has a hard time with, to say the least. Christian or non-Christian, it's difficult for people to understand how a God who claims to be loving and caring and nurturing and providing, how that God can then turn around and command his people to kill them. All of them. It's hard. So this is an important passage. People, if they don't know anything about the Bible, they know that in the Old Testament, a lot of people died. And God was telling a lot of people to kill a lot of people. And in the New Testament, Jesus is love and light and sweetness. And they look at the Old Testament and they say, I don't want any of that. Give me Jesus. And on the one hand, they are, of course, ignoring all the love and provision and light and grace in the Old Testament. And at the same time, ignoring the fact that when Jesus comes back, a lot of people are going to die. You ever thought about that? Strange as that may seem, when Jesus comes back, right, and the kingdom is set up, and then after that, at the end of the kingdom, there's going to be a lot of people are dying. People who shake their fist at God are going to be punished. That theme is not new in the New Testament. It's actually old, and it comes through the Old Testament and continues on into the New. At the end, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess, and many of those knees will be bowing because they're forced to, not because they want to. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, God gives Israel instructions for how to make war. Let's begin. Chapter 20, verses 1 through 9 is one section. 10 through 18 is another, and then 19 and 20 at the end. 20, 1 through 9. 19 and 20 at the end. Let's begin. Verse 1. When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemies today. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. The officers shall also speak to the people, saying, Who is the man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would dedicate it. Who is the man who has planted a vineyard and has not begun to use its fruit? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would begin to use its fruit. And who is the man who is engaged to a woman and has not married her? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise he might die in the battle, and another man would marry her. Then the officers shall speak further to the people and say, Who is the man that is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's hearts melt like his. When the officers have finished speaking to the people, they shall appoint commanders of the army at the head of the people. Notice, we've talked about the theme of anticipation in Deuteronomy. Here's another example. There's going to be a time, Israel, you'll move into the land and you will be outnumbered. You will move into the land and you're going to go out to battle against your enemies, and they will have more horses than you. They will have more chariots than you. They will have more people than you have. If you look forward into the time of Joshua and then the Judges, and even on into 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Israel oftentimes is outnumbered. Sometimes they're outnumbered so much, the text doesn't even give us a number. In 2nd Chronicles, King Asa faces the Ethiopian Zerah, and the text just tells us myriad upon myriads the enemy had. Or in other cases, the Philistines gather against Saul, and their troops were as many as the number of grains of sand on the seashore. Doesn't even give us a number. It's just so many. In the face of that kind of opposition, you can imagine one emotion sets in: absolute panic. Fear. You show up on the battlefield, you wake up in the morning, and I'm going home. Forget it. This is crazy. We'll never win. Apparently, I've been told, during just after, was it the Lebanese Civil War? It was one of the civil wars in Lebanon, one of the wars. The American military airlifted all their tanks from the ships out at sea in the Mediterranean overnight. So it's dark, you hear these helicopters, these guys are all fighting. When they woke up in the morning, there were tanks everywhere. I mean, that's done that way on purpose, right? So that you wake up and you say, oh no, okay, we quit. I don't think it worked that way as well, but that was the intention. The same thing with the beginning of Iraq War number 2, right? What do we call it? Shock and awe, right? The idea was to just bomb them so much that the army would melt away. And in that case, it largely worked. I mean, they melted away into the population. I'll never forget the scene of that Iraqi information minister standing in front of his cameras saying, we're going to beat them. We're going to destroy me. We're doing great. Meanwhile, you can hear the shelling and the bombing and the mayhem that's going on around him on camera. We're going to do great. No, the fear had already penetrated his troops and they were fleeing. The point is, in the face of that kind of opposition, Israel has one reason to not be afraid. Notice that the text says nothing about superior weapons, larger amounts of people, the strength of the Israelite men. Nothing. No, not a word. That's exactly what we would do. We would say, that's going to be a tough fight. That's okay. Our men have better armor, better weapons. We have better intelligence, better strategy, more experience. Nothing. In this case, there's only one thing that Israel can stand on. Don't be afraid. A strange command as a command, right? I command you, do not be afraid. How do you command someone to not be afraid? This morning, my son is being switched from one class to another class because the class he's in is kind of rough. And he's being switched to a whole nother class. He's petrified. How do you walk up to a kid and say, I command you, don't hit your sister and don't be afraid. Stop being afraid right now. You can't do it, right? I mean, so God issues the command, but then I think understanding that you got to give me a reason to not be afraid, he says, look, the Lord your God who brought you up from the land of Egypt is with you. I love that he doesn't just say, I'm with you. Although that would be sufficient. He goes out of his way to mention what is most certainly the most important event in Israel's history. And that event was a military one. When Israel was in Egypt, God brought them out, and this was a fight, and God won. Remember that at the time, Egypt was the most powerful nation in the ancient Near East. They were at their peak, and God defeated them and brought his people out. So Israel, as you go into battle, don't forget who's with you. God is on your side to fight for you. And so, as you approach the battle, who leads? Who leads the troops? It's the priest. As you go to battle, as you're approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people and say to them, don't be faint-hearted, don't be afraid or panic or tremble, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies in order to save you. I love that. The image of the fighting God who goes before his people for one purpose, to save them. Now, you pick that theme up, and you can trace that theme all the way, I would argue, from here all the way through to the end of the New Testament. God fighting on behalf of his people. Think about that, right? In all the wars of the kings of Judah, in all the wars of the kings of Israel, in all the times when his people come back from exile and are in conflict, Nehemiah, Ezra, these guys all have the same faith. Moving into the New Testament, the apostles understand that in the biggest fight we all face, the fight against sin, God is still the one out there fighting to save us. All the way down through the end, God fights on behalf of his people, and he saves them. And so what we have here is a theme that's huge in the Bible. God coming to the aid of his people when they have no strength. They have no strength. People can turn to him, and he will save them. The officers also are going to speak to the people as they head out to battle. And here we see, yes, there's command to war, but God has apparently mixed in an aspect of compassion for those who are going out to fight. And so it's very, very practical at the same time. I suspect, and some of the commentators say, listen, you don't want people in battle who don't want to be there, right? Part of the value of the American army in the last few wars has been that it's been a volunteer army for the most part, not all the time, but it's been a volunteer army. World War II, those guys were volunteers. Some of them, if you watch the miniseries Band of Brothers, there were men who killed themselves, committed suicide because they couldn't go fight for their country. Everybody in their town went, and these guys had flat feet or whatever, couldn't go, and they sacrificed themselves. They committed suicide because they wanted to fight for their country. Those are the kind of people you want in battle. So there are some circumstances where maybe people don't want to be there, and God gives them a few outs. Number one, to the man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it, let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise, somebody else is going to get the house. The idea being this person has built a home or has purchased a home or for whatever reason has not yet taken possession of it. He's made his investment, but he's not yet begun to reap the rewards of that possession. This person gets to go back home. Otherwise, if he dies in battle, somebody else is going to come take his house. And so that might seem trivial to us. Another way to look at it is God having compassion on his people, and at the same time, making sure that people who don't want to be in battle don't have to be there, because that would be dangerous to everyone else. Right? You know how it is. You are working on a project with some other people, and there are a few who don't want to be there. And all they do is what? Complain and whine, and they don't pick up their fair share of the labor. It's very discouraging. The same thing then for someone who's planted a vineyard. That is, he's done all the work, planting these crops, fertilizing them, getting them ready, and the fruit's on the tree, but it's green. He doesn't get to use it yet. War comes. If he gets killed, somebody else is going to take the benefit that he had put into that property. Answer, not right. Let him go home and get a reprieve from military service so that he can enjoy the fruit of his vineyard. And then finally, perhaps many of us would say the most important of all, somebody who just got married or is about to get married and doesn't get to begin his life with his new spouse. Who is the man that is engaged to a woman and has not married her? Let him depart and return to his house. Otherwise, he might die in battle, and another man would marry her. This one has another addition, that is, if he marries her and they don't actually begin their family life together, this man might leave no heirs. And so, in the interest of preserving the family name in Israel, this would give this man a chance to go home. The text doesn't say how long he would stay. He's exempt from war. The idea being he gets to enjoy the company of his new wife, and potentially new heirs would be born, and his name would carry on. Notice, these are areas where I think God is being compassionate to his people on two levels. One, he's removing from the battlefield the people who don't want to be there. That would be dangerous for everyone else. And at the same time, he's being compassionate. This gets reinforced in this last verse, verses 8 and 9. Then the officer shall speak further to the people and say, "Who is the man who is afraid and faint-hearted? Let him depart and return to his house, so that he might not make his brother's hearts melt like his heart." Notice, we begin this section with, don't be afraid. As a command, I would say, not a suggestion. Don't be afraid. In this context, fear says something about faith and about who God is. Right? Think about that. If I tell you, don't be afraid, I'm going to take care of you. And you say to me, no, I would rather be afraid. On the one hand, that says something about your faith. Not just your faith, but your faith in me. And therefore, it says something about me. When Israel instead chooses to be afraid, they are saying, I don't have faith in you, God. And they're also saying, you are not worthy of my faith. Do you see that? That's almost blasphemous. I won't believe you. You are not believable. That is, Lord, I can't trust you to take care of us in battle because maybe you won't actually save us. That's rough. That is blasphemous. If God stands there and says, I'm going to save you, I will fight for you, and they say, nah, we don't think so. Scandalous. But at the same time, I love this. Notice that God anticipates that people are sinful and weak of faith. And so in verse 8, what we see there is the understanding that, you know what? There are going to be fearful people that might not want to be fearful, but they're fearful. And so there's not a harsh punishment for them. There's permission. Go home. It's okay. Better that you go home than you stay here and what? Make everybody else afraid. We're going into war. This is going to be a fight. People are going to die. So if you're afraid, go home and remove that from the midst of the army. So two poles there. On the one hand, a command to trust God, to not be afraid, to depend on his ability to deliver. And on the other hand, an acknowledgement that people are weak, that people do lack faith. And God's compassion stands out in multiple ways. This is a theme also in the whole Old Testament. Compassion and mercy and grace demonstrated here yet again. God has expectations and he wants them to be obeyed. But at the same time, he has compassion and mercy, knowing that we are dust. So, you have a situation where Israel is commanded to go to war, and God gives them directions on how to manage themselves. What do you do when you're going to fight a city and have to negotiate with them before the fight? In verse 10. Notice, when you approach a city to fight against it, offer it terms of peace. The assumption right away in verse 10 is that this is not what kind of city? A nearby city. This is not a city in the land, right? The cities in the land, they were supposed to wipe out completely. This must be another kind of city because the initial diplomatic move is offer them peace. It anticipates a day when Israel is going to be growing. And we see this in Israel's history. Saul comes to power, has a hard time. But when David comes to power, he whips up on all their enemies around. The Philistines are suppressed. The Ammonites are suppressed. The Moabites are suppressed. The Edomites, the Tyrians make a treaty way up in the north. He suppresses all those nations too. These are cities that are far away, and they're being brought under the sphere of influence of Israel. That is, Israel is is the regional hegemon. They're the big power, and they bring everybody under their authority. How do you do it? You approach them, you offer them terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, a literal metaphor, right? In days of a walled city, when you're under siege, that gate is closed. If they make peace, demonstrate that peace by opening the gate, then all the people who are found in it, in the city, shall become your forced labor, and they shall serve you. So these people are not coming in as Israelite citizens. They're not being brought in on the same level. They're being made servants and slaves of Israel. Notice, it's gracious and compassionate, right? Because they weren't killed. They weren't killed. They're brought in. However, if the city does not make peace with you, but makes war with you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, again that theme, the Lord giving them these things in military victory, when the Lord gives it into your hand, you strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. That is, most likely, all the fighting men. These are the people who are going to be around to rebel, to create problems. Kill all the men with the edge of the sword, but everything else you can take. Now this is a big difference from what we're going to see in the next few verses, where everything else is dedicated to the Lord. In this case, Israel gets the benefit. Only the women and the children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself. You shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave anything alive that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things, which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. So in the last verses of this section, we get that other group of cities, that local group of cities in which God says everybody goes. The first group are far away. I would suggest that the assumption is their detestable practices are so far away that they're not going to be an influence. But the cities nearby, those cities are going to play an influential role in Israel's. If anybody's still there, if anybody's left alive, Israel, you will be tempted to sin the way they sin. And so, one group, the women and children get to live, and all their possessions get to be taken. The other group, everything goes. Everything gets annihilated and is dedicated to the Lord. A good example of how this works out, we can find it in Joshua chapter 9. If you will turn there, Joshua chapter 9, we get a famous and tragic story of the Gibeonites. Remember that name? The Gibeonites? Joshua and company had come into the land, and they had already destroyed the cities of Jericho and Ai, and the word is spreading. If you remember, Jericho down in the Jordan Rift Valley, and then Ai, not too far from it, up in the central Benjamin Plateau, the word gets around these cities in the middle, these cities in the central Benjamin Plateau, in particular, Geba, Gibeah, Gibeon, Mitzpah, Ramah, these cities right in the middle, that, hey, the Israelites are coming and they're killing everybody. And so what happens? Joshua chapter 9, verse 3, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they acted craftily and set out as envoys and took worn out sacks on their donkeys and wineskins, worn out and torn and mended, and worn out and patched sandals on their feet and worn out clothes on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and had become crumbled. They went to Joshua, to the camp at Gibeon, and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us." I wonder if, I guess it's remotely possible that they were aware that God had a different rule for people who were far away. It's perhaps more likely that this was just the custom of the ancient Near East. You don't have to make harsh treaties with distant neighbors. It's only people that are in your immediate context that you need to defend yourself against. So they pretend, "We're from a faraway place. Make a covenant with us." The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you are living within our land. How shall we make a covenant with you?" They know from their side that God had said, don't make a covenant with anybody living in the land. And so they ask the right question. Maybe you guys are living nearby. We can't make a deal with you. And so what do? They lie. "Your servants have come from a very far country. We heard the fame of the Lord your God. We heard the report about him, all that he did to the two Amorite kings. Our king said, 'Take provisions.' Look, the bread was hot when we took it from our house. The wineskins were filled. We look like we've come on a long journey, don't we? We're from far away." And sadly, verse 14, the men of Israel took some of their provisions, that is, they believed their act, their ruse, and they did not ask for the counsel of the Lord. And the tragedy of this story is that, A, they did not ask for the counsel of the Lord, but the Gibeonites were not from far, far away. They were from right in the middle of the country. That's the tragedy, is that, boy, if you'd made that mistake with people up here or somebody over here, you can say, okay, fine, we'll just cut that part out of the land and bomb it and nobody gets to live there. But they're right in the middle. They're right in the middle. And Israel pays for it for a long time. Eventually, even Saul is going to lose his patience with the Gibeonites, kill a bunch of them, and then God's going to take it out on Saul's family. 7 of Saul's sons are going to have to die because he was mean to those Gibeonites. So, 2 situations. If a city's far away, you offer it peace. And if they don't accept your peace, you can kill all the men, but you get everybody else as a possession. If the city's close, done. They must die, because otherwise they will teach you to do detestable things. Now, last 2 verses seem kind of strange, but they fit. Likely, the theme came from the idea of the siege in verse 12. You may besiege the city. Verse 19, when you besiege a city a long time to make war against it in order to capture it, don't destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them, for you may eat from them. You shall not cut them down. For is the tree of the field a man that it should be besieged by you? Only the trees which you know are not fruit trees you shall destroy and cut down, that you may construct siege works against the city that is making war against you until it falls. This is kind of odd. Protect the trees, right? God is the original tree hugger. Well, of course, he made them. So there's a sense in which he cares about all of his creation. We're going to see in another place in Deuteronomy, God cares about creation. When you see a mother hen on its nest or a bird on its nest, you can take the egg, but you can't take the bird and the egg. All right, sustainability, people want to say, that's fine, I'm interested in that. Notice also, however, that God is protecting Israel in not allowing them to just decimate the whole countryside, ruin everything, but is forcing them to leave the fruit trees. That is, the trees that can be a benefit to them. In times of war, you might be tempted to just lay waste to the earth, Israel. Don't do it. There's benefit for you. So there's actually quite a bit of benefit in this whole chapter. Go to war, but there are some of you who built a house and you might not reap the benefit of it. Go home. There's some of you who planted a vineyard. You might not reap the benefit of it. Go home. Some of you who married a wife. You might not reap the benefit of it. Go home. Make peace. If they don't want your peace, kill the men and reap the benefit, the spoils of war. And as well, when you besiege a city and you're going to attack it and you need raw materials to build your siege engines, pick the trees from which you won't get a benefit. Notice that the text reminds us, is that tree a man that it should be besieged by you? That's a tricky passage. I don't think what we have here are references to the tree of life or to the Garden of Eden or things like that. I think the point is, it's almost a humorous illustration. Listen, don't destroy everything in your path in your attempts to make war. Set aside the trees from which you will receive a benefit. And so in that sense, it's in keeping with the concern for the Lord to provide a benefit for his people. It's yet another example of his compassion on them, even at a time of war. So, it's a difficult text. Notice that God is not saying war is bad. McConville notes that war is in fact a part of life, that God doesn't get rid of here, but instead regulates. He doesn't get rid of war. He doesn't ever tell his people, I'm going to fight for you, just stay home, there will be no war other than the war that I fight. No, it's a sinful world. It's a sinful world. God at times is going to use Israel to bring judgment on his enemies, and at other times they're going to be attacked. He's going to be bringing war on them to punish them. God regulates war. The assumption is it's a part of life. Number two, notice McConville suggests this does not give permission for crusades. Right? These texts don't come over into the New Testament the way some people might want them to. This is not a case of, okay, we're going after our enemies. God is on our side. Let's go wipe them out. Right? The Crusaders during that period in world history were mistaken. They were, hear me say it, mistaken. They should not have been taking texts like this and using them to justify their wars throughout the Middle East. Should not have done it. These texts don't apply. We don't make war on our neighborhood and go attack the it just doesn't work. Sometimes I wonder if Christians look at the wars of this country around the world and read them through this lens and justify what we're doing because of the Bible. Now, there may be other reasons to justify war, but you'd have a hard time convincing me that Deuteronomy 20 is the text that you should use to do it. And finally, they do remind us that God is at war with evil. They do remind us God is fighting evil. He fought to bring his people out of Egypt, and he continues to fight evil to this day. And the day is coming when there's going to be another huge battle against evil. And then finally, the promise of heaven itself is that there will be no more war, no more crying, no more death, right? There will be perfect peace forever.